Highway 441 disappeared under 2 feet of snow in 40 minutes. Pierce Grant was the last man stupid enough to still be riding. His Harley died a mile back, frozen solid, abandoned like a tombstone in the drift. Now, he was carrying her. 70 years old, hypothermic, 3 miles to go. His rivals would call him soft for this. They'd laugh at the biker who played hero to a grandma nobody knew. But the day the call happened, laughter was over. Where are you watching this from right now? I need to know how far this story reaches, and drop your city in the comments below. You're new here, hit that subscribe button. Now let's get into the story. Here's the question nobody asks when they see a biker carry an old woman through a blizzard. What if kindness isn't weakness? What if it's the most ruthless power move you can make? We're conditioned to believe that mercy and dominance are opposites, that tough guys don't stop for strangers, that motorcycle clubs, especially the ones that live by patches and codes and blood oaths, operate on intimidation, not compassion. The world tells us that Pierce Grant should have kept riding, should have left Marie in that frozen Cadillac because stopping makes you vulnerable, because rivals smell weakness like wolves smell blood. But what if the world has it backwards? Pierce Grant wasn't trying to be a hero that February night. The Iron Hounds, MC, his club, his family, his reason for breathing, was 3 months from bankruptcy. Their clubhouse in Gatlinburg was mortgaged to the hilt. The rival gang, the Copperhead Kings, had been circling like vultures, buying up property, pushing the Iron Hounds out of every profitable corner of Sevier County. Pierce's president was talking about dissolving the chapter, about surrendering their patch, about admitting that 30 years of brotherhood meant nothing when you couldn't pay the electric bill. So no, Pierce wasn't thinking about heroism when he spotted that pale blue Cadillac nose down in the ravine off Highway 441. He was thinking about survival, about getting home before the blizzard killed him, the way it was about to kill the Tennessee tourism season and whatever was left of his club's finances. But then he saw her hand pressed against the driver's side window. Marie Ashford was 73 years old, a retired school teacher who'd lived alone in the Smokies for 40 years after her husband died in a logging accident. She had no children, no family, just a modest house on 20 acres that nobody knew about, and a Cadillac that had slid off the road when the ice hit faster than her reflexes could handle. She'd been trapped for 2 hours. The cold had already started shutting down her organs. 10 more minutes and she'd have been another statistic in the February death toll. Pierce could have called 911 and kept riding. Should have. The rescue teams were already overwhelmed. 14 stranded motorists, 6 accidents, 2 confirmed fatalities. The dispatcher would have told him they'd get to her when they could, which meant never. By the time the plows cleared Highway 441, Marie would be frozen solid in a car that had become her coffin. So Pierce made a choice. He ditched his bike, wrapped Marie in his leather cut, the sacred jacket that marked him as Iron Hound's road captain, the symbol of everything he'd earned in 20 years of riding. And he carried her, 3 miles through waist-deep snow, through wind that hit 40 miles per hour, through cold that turned his beard into icicles and his hands into useless clubs of frozen meat. The ranger station saved her life. Pierce collapsed the moment he laid her on the heated floor, his body shutting down from hypothermia and exhaustion. They were both airlifted to University of Tennessee Medical Center. Both spent 3 days recovering. And when Pierce finally visited Marie's room, expecting nothing more than a polite thank you, she looked at him with eyes that had seen 7 decades of human cruelty and kindness, and said, "You're the first person in 40 years who treated me like I mattered." That should have been the end of the story. Biker saves woman, woman thanks biker. Everyone moves on. But 2 things happened that turned this into something else entirely. First, the Copperhead Kings found out, and they made Pierce's act of mercy the joke of Sevier County. Second, Marie Ashford wasn't just a retired schoolteacher living on a modest teacher's pension. She was the silent landowner of half the commercial property in Gatlinburg, including the building where the Copperhead Kings had built their fortress. And when she died 8 weeks after the blizzard, she left every single acre to the biker who'd proven that kindness wasn't extinct in the Smoky Mountains. The question isn't why Pierce saved her. The question is, what happens when the thing you do out of pure human decency accidentally destroys your enemies more completely than violence ever could? Let's start with what you think this story is about. You think it's about karma, about cosmic justice, about how doing good gets rewarded and doing evil gets punished, like the universe keeps score, and eventually the bullies get what's coming to them. That's the Disney version. And for the first month after the rescue, that's exactly what it looked like. Pierce returned to the Iron Hounds clubhouse to a hero's welcome. His brothers had seen the news coverage. Local stations ate up the story of the tough biker with a heart of gold. Road captain risks life to save elderly woman in historic blizzard. The optics were perfect. For one beautiful moment, the Iron Hounds weren't the scary motorcycle club that made tourists nervous. They were the good guys, the protectors. The club's phone rang off the hook. Donations poured in from people who wanted to support the hero biker. A local brewery offered to sponsor their annual charity ride. The mayor of Gatlinburg personally called Pierce to thank him for representing the best of Tennessee values. For 2 weeks, Pierce was untouchable. And then Jeb Thornton walked into the Rusty Sprocket. Jeb was the sergeant-at-arms for the Copperhead Kings, a man who'd done 8 years in Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary for aggravated assault, and had the kind of smile that promised violence. He was 6'5", 280 pounds of scar tissue and bad decisions, and he ruled the Copperhead Kings through fear and a willingness to do things other men wouldn't. The Rusty Sprocket was neutral territory, the only bar in Sevier County where both clubs could drink without starting a war. But neutrality didn't mean respect. And the moment Jeb saw Pierce sitting at the bar nursing a whiskey, he smelled opportunity. "Well, well, well," Jeb's voice boomed across the room. "If it ain't Grandma's boy himself, tell me, Pierce, did she knit you a sweater after you tucked her in?" The bar went quiet. Every biker in the room knew what was happening. Jeb was testing, pushing, seeing if the hero act had made Pierce soft, seeing if the Iron Hounds road captain would back down from a public challenge. Pierce didn't turn around, just took another sip of whiskey and said quietly, "You got something to say, Jeb. Say it. Otherwise, shut your mouth and let me drink in peace." Jeb laughed, the kind of laugh that had no humor in it. He walked over, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and leaned against the bar right next to Pierce, close enough that Pierce could smell the cheap beer and cheaper cologne. "What I got to say is this," Jeb said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You Iron Hounds used to be something, used to be men. Now you're playing nurse to senior citizens and begging for donations like some kind of charity case. Your club is dying, Pierce. And you know what? It deserves to die. Because real men don't waste time on useless old bats who can't even drive in snow." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Pierce's hands tightened around his glass. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and put Jeb through the bar, to defend Marie's honor, to prove that mercy didn't equal weakness. But Pierce had learned a long time ago that violence was easy, that any idiot with fists could start a fight. The hard thing, the thing that separated men from animals, was choosing not to. So Pierce finished his whiskey, stood up, and looked Jeb straight in the eye. "You're right," Pierce said quietly. "My club is struggling. We're broke. We're losing territory. And yeah, I spent 3 days in the hospital because I carried an old woman through a blizzard instead of leaving her to die. You see that as weakness. I see it as the only thing I've done in the last year that actually mattered." He dropped cash on the bar and walked out. Behind him, the Copperhead Kings erupted in laughter. Jeb's voice followed him into the parking lot. "Enjoy poverty, Grandma's boy. We'll send flowers when your club closes." For the next 6 weeks, that nickname followed Pierce everywhere. Grandma's boy. The Copperhead Kings spray-painted it on the Iron Hounds clubhouse. They put it on T-shirts. They made it trend on local social media, and every time Pierce rode through Gatlinburg, he'd see them, Jeb and his crew, sitting outside their massive clubhouse on River Road, the building they'd renovated into a fortress, laughing and pointing whenever Pierce rode past. The mockery worked. Donations dried up. The positive press faded. And the Iron Hounds' financial situation got worse. By mid-April, they had 2 months of mortgage payments left before the bank foreclosed. Pierce visited Marie 3 times at the hospital, then weekly after she moved back home. They'd talk for hours about her late husband, about Pierce's club, about loneliness and purpose and what it meant to matter. She never mentioned money, never hinted at wealth. Just an old woman grateful for company and a biker who'd learned that sometimes the best conversations happen with people who have nothing left to prove. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late April, Marie died peacefully in her sleep. Pierce found out from a phone call from the hospice nurse. He rode to her house that afternoon, stood on the porch where they'd drunk sweet tea and talked about nothing important, and cried for the first time in 15 years. He thought that was the end of the story, the end of the friendship, the end of whatever brief moment of goodness had interrupted the slow collapse of his life. He was wrong. 3 days later, a lawyer named Douglas Pemberton called the Iron Hounds clubhouse and asked to speak with Pierce Grant regarding the estate of Marie Catherine Ashford. Pierce figured it was a courtesy call. Maybe Marie had left him something small, a photograph, a keepsake, something to remember her by. He agreed to meet Pemberton at his office in downtown Gatlinburg. What he didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Marie Ashford had been playing a very long game, and Pierce had just walked into the endgame. Douglas Pemberton's office overlooked the main strip of Gatlinburg, all the tourist traps and pancake houses that made Sevier County's economy hum. He was old-school Tennessee legal. 3-piece suit, silver hair, the kind of lawyer who'd handled property disputes since before Pierce was born. When Pierce walked in, Pemberton stood, shook his hand, and said, "Mr. Grant, I've been Marie Ashford's attorney for 42 years. I'm going to tell you something that will sound impossible. I need you to sit down first." Pierce sat, wary, confused. Pemberton slid a folder across the desk. "Marie instructed me to give you this after her passing. Before we discuss the will, I need you to understand who Marie actually was." "She was a school teacher," Pierce said. "Retired, lived alone." "That's what everyone thought." Pemberton opened the folder. Inside were property deeds, dozens of them. Marie's husband, Thomas Ashford, died in 1983. What nobody knew is that Thomas had been quietly buying land in Sevier County since the 1960s, before the tourism boom, before Gatlinburg became a destination. He was a logger by day and a very, very smart investor by night. When he died, he owned approximately 1,200 acres of prime real estate. Marie inherited everything. Pierce stared at the documents, his brain struggling to process. 1,200 acres? She could have developed it, could have become a millionaire 10 times over. Instead, she leased it out quietly. Most of the tenants never knew who actually owned the land. She lived modestly, drove an old car, kept teaching because she loved it, and she watched Gatlinburg grow around her properties, waiting. Waiting for what? Pemberton leaned back. I asked her that once. She said she was waiting to find out if there was anyone left in this county who gave a damn about people instead of profit. Pierce felt his chest tighten. Mr. Pemberton, why are you telling me this? The lawyer pulled out a single document, a last will and testament. Because Marie left everything to you, Mr. Grant. Every acre, every lease, every building. The entire estate, valued at approximately $47 million, is yours. The room tilted. Pierce heard the words, but they didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. No. That's impossible. I barely knew her. I carried her through a storm. She was very clear in her instructions. Pemberton slid the will across the desk. I'll read the relevant passage. I leave my entire estate to Pierce Grant, road captain of the Iron Hounds Motorcycle Club, because he is the only person in 40 years who treated me like a human being instead of an obstacle. He risked his life for a stranger. He visited me not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. And when the world mocked him for showing kindness, he did not change. That is the kind of man who deserves to control what I've built. That is the kind of man who will use power responsibly. Pierce's hands were shaking. $47 million, I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything immediately, but there's one detail you need to know. Pemberton pulled out another document. Among the properties Marie owned is a 12,000-square-foot commercial building at 2847 River Road in Gatlinburg. It's been leased to a business called Copperhead Investments, LLC, since 2019. They pay $8,000 a month under a year-to-year lease that renews every January. Pierce's blood went cold. River Road. That's the Copperhead Kings clubhouse. Pemberton's face remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes. Satisfaction. Marie knew who they were. She knew how they'd treated you, and her instructions were very specific. Mr. Grant has full authority to manage all leases as he sees fit, including termination with 30 days' notice as outlined in the standard lease agreement. The room went silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Pierce looked down at the deed to 2847 River Road. At the lease agreement signed by Jeb Thornton on behalf of Copperhead Investments, LLC. At the clause that gave the landowner, him now, the right to terminate the lease for any reason with 30 days written notice. She gave me their home, Pierce whispered. She gave you justice, Pemberton corrected. What you do with it is your choice. But Mr. Grant? Marie told me something before she died. She said, Pierce will want to be merciful. That's who he is. But sometimes mercy for the cruel is cruelty to the innocent. Don't let him forget that. Pierce sat there for 20 minutes, staring at documents that had just rewritten his entire life. The Iron Hounds were saved. More than saved. They were set for generations. He could pay off the mortgage, buy new bikes, renovate the clubhouse, actually help the community instead of just surviving in it. But that wasn't what made his heart hammer in his chest. What made his heart hammer was the thought of walking into the rusty sprocket, of walking past Jeb and the Copperhead Kings with the deed to their fortress in his pocket, of watching their faces when they realized that the man they'd mocked as Grandma's boy now owned the ground they stood on. Pemberton must have seen it in his eyes because he said quietly, "Marie asked me to give you one more thing." He pulled out an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on floral stationery. "Pierce, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person, but I was afraid you'd refuse. You're too good for your own good sometimes. Here's what you need to understand. The Copperhead Kings have been bullies for 20 years. They've intimidated families. They've pushed out small businesses. They've made this county harder and meaner and smaller. And they've done it from my property while mocking the only man who showed me I still mattered. So here's my gift to you. Not money, though God knows you've earned it. My gift is permission. Permission to be ruthless for once. Permission to show them that kindness isn't weakness, it's strategy. Make them pay rent to the man they called soft. Make them understand that the world doesn't belong to the loudest and the meanest. It belongs to the people who stop when someone needs help. I love you, sweetheart. Be the storm they never saw coming. Marie." Pierce folded the note carefully, tucked it in his vest pocket, and for the first time in 8 weeks, he smiled. Pierce didn't tell anyone at first, not his president, not his brothers. He spent 3 days with lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors, making sure everything was airtight, making sure that when he made his move, there would be no escape hatch for the Copperhead Kings. On the 4th day, he rode to 2847 River Road. The Copperhead Kings clubhouse was everything the Iron Hounds wasn't. New construction, professional signage, a parking lot that could hold 50 bikes. They'd built it to intimidate, to announce that they owned Gatlinburg and everyone in it was just renting space. Pierce parked his Harley directly in front of the main entrance. 15 Copperhead Kings were in the lot, working on bikes, drinking beer, laughing about something. They saw him immediately. Jeb was the first to react. He stood up from the picnic table where he'd been holding court, that same predatory smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," Jeb called out. "Grandma's boy came to visit. You here to cry about your club dying? Or did another old lady need someone to hold her purse?" The other Copperheads laughed. Right on cue, right on script. Pierce walked slowly toward them. Didn't smile, didn't speak. Just reached into his vest and pulled out a document. He handed it to Jeb. "What's this?" Jeb said, still smiling. "That's a 30-day notice of lease termination," Pierce said calmly. "You've got 1 month to vacate the property." The laughter died. Jeb looked down at the paper, his smile freezing. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that I own this building, and the land it sits on, and every other property Marie Ashford used to lease in this county. She left everything to me, and your lease, signed right there on page 3, gives me the right to terminate with 30 days' notice. So here's your notice. You've got until June 15th to get out." The color drained from Jeb's face. "You're lying. Call your lawyer." Pierce pulled out his phone. "Here's the contact info for Douglas Pemberton. He'll confirm everything. The deed's already filed with the county. It's public record. You can look it up yourself." Jeb stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. The other copperheads closed in, reading over his shoulder, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to rage. "This is bullshit," one of them shouted. "You can't just—" "I can," Pierce interrupted, "and I am. You've got 30 days. After that, if you're still here, I'll have the sheriff escort you off the property. And if you resist, I'll have you arrested for trespassing on land I own." Jeb's hands were shaking. Not from fear, from fury. "You're making a mistake, Pierce, a big mistake. You think you can just walk in here?" "I'm not walking in," Pierce said quietly. "I'm standing on property I own while giving you legal notice to leave. There's a difference." "We'll fight this," Jeb said, his voice rising. "We'll take you to court. You'll lose." Pierce's voice was steady, cold. "Your lease is ironclad. Marie's lawyers made sure of that. You've got no grounds to contest. And even if you did, how long do you think that fight would take? 6 months? A year? You planning to operate a clubhouse while I'm your landlord? Because I can make that very uncomfortable. I can inspect the property every week. I can cite violations. I can triple your insurance requirements. I can make every single day you stay here a bureaucratic nightmare." The copperheads looked at each other. The math was simple and brutal. They'd invested hundreds of thousands of dollars renovating this building. They'd made it their identity. And now it was all dust, because they'd mocked the wrong man. "Why?" Jeb's voice cracked. "Why are you doing this?" Pierce stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fear behind Jeb's eyes. "You called Marie a useless old bat. You said real men don't waste time on people like her. You made a joke out of the fact that I thought her life was worth saving. So here's your lesson, Jeb. That useless old bat just destroyed you. And she did it because she believed the world should belong to people who give a damn about each other instead of people who step on whoever's weaker." He turned to address all of them. "You've got 30 days. Use them wisely." Pierce walked back to his bike. Behind him, silence. No threats. No violence. Just the sound of 15 men realizing they'd been outplayed by the one person they'd underestimated. When Pierce reached his Harley, Jeb called out one last time. "This isn't over." Pierce looked back. "Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet." The next 30 days were chaos. The Copperhead Kings tried everything. They hired lawyers who confirmed what Pierce already knew. The lease was unbreakable and the termination was legal. They tried to negotiate, offering to pay more rent, offering to sign a long-term lease, offering to publicly apologize for the mockery. Pierce refused every offer. They tried intimidation, showing up at the Iron Hounds clubhouse, making veiled threats. Pierce called the police every time, documented every incident, and made it clear that he would pursue legal action for harassment. They tried going public, posting on social media about how a corrupt biker was using inherited wealth to abuse small businesses. But the internet had already chosen its side. The story of the biker who saved an old woman and was rewarded for his kindness while his bullies got evicted, that was too perfect, too satisfying. The narrative wave was unstoppable. By day 25, half the Copperhead Kings had quit the club. They saw the writing on the wall. Their leadership had picked a fight with karma and lost. By day 29, Jeb Thornton dissolved Copperhead Investments LLC and started packing. On day 30, Pierce Grant stood outside 2847 River Road and watched as the last of the Copperhead Kings loaded their belongings into trucks and rode off into the Tennessee sunset. No final confrontation. No dramatic standoff. Just defeat, quiet and complete. When the building was empty, Pierce walked through it one last time, saw where they'd hung their patches, saw where they'd celebrated their victories, saw the empire they'd built on borrowed land. And then he called his president. "We're moving in." The Iron Hounds held their first meeting in the new clubhouse on July 4th. They hung an American flag. They hung their charter. And in the place of honor, right behind the president's chair, they hung a framed photograph of Marie Ashford smiling in her garden, holding a glass of sweet tea. Pierce stood before his brothers and told them the full story. About the blizzard, about Marie, about the will, about walking into the enemy's fortress not with violence, but with a deed. When he finished, his president stood and said what everyone was thinking. "That old lady just saved our entire club by dying. How the hell do we honor that?" Pierce looked at Marie's photograph, at the woman who'd spent 40 years invisible to her community until a biker had proven she mattered. "We do what she did," Pierce said. "We look for the people everyone else ignores, the stranded motorists, the struggling families, the invisible ones, and we treat them like they matter, because that's what brotherhood actually means. Not intimidation, not territory, care." 3 years later, the Iron Hounds run the most successful community outreach program in Sevier County. They rescue stranded hikers. They deliver food to elderly shut-ins. They mentor at-risk kids. And when tourists ask about the photograph of the old woman behind the bar, they tell the story of how kindness destroyed their enemies more completely than violence ever could. The Copperhead Kings, they scattered. Jeb Thornton moved to Kentucky and disappeared from the biker scene entirely. The others joined different clubs or quit riding altogether. And Pierce Grant, the man they'd called Grandma's Boy, became the most respected road captain in Tennessee. Not because he was the toughest, because he'd proven that the most ruthless thing you can do in a cruel world is refuse to become cruel yourself. Marie knew what she was doing. She didn't give Pierce money. She gave him proof. Proof that the world bends toward people who stop when someone needs help. That mercy isn't weakness, it's strategy. That the longest game is always kindness. And when you play the longest game, eventually you own the board. If you believe that kindness isn't weakness, that mercy can be the most ruthless power move you'll ever make, like and share this story so it reaches someone who's been called soft for doing the right thing. Subscribe now for more stories. Also check out the 2 videos showing on the screen right now, specially crafted for you.